upright. Figure 4. Negative loop down. Two-point roll on the bottom. Sorry, 2 full rolls on the bottom. And figure upright. Figure 5.
Aresti family 7 is divided into 5 subfamilies shown here. 7.2 is half loops. 7.3 are 3/4 loops. 7.4 are whole loops and reversing whole loops, including square loops. 7.5 are horizontal and vertical S's. 7.8 are horizontal 8s, super 8s, and vertical 8s. Aresti's subfamily 7.2 figures are built around half loops. The figures in this subfamily may have an upright or inverted entry line, they have a half loop segment, and they have an upright or inverted exit line. As shown in the 4 examples here, complementary rolls may be added to the entry and exit lines. The leftmost example is what we commonly call an Immelman, a half loop up, half roll. The next example is a variation on what we would call a split S, with a 1.5 roll into the half loop down from an inverted entry. The third example is a inverted or a negative half loop up preceded by a half roll. And the last example on the right is a full snap roll pushing into a half loop down with 2 of 4 at the bottom. Judging criteria. The looping segments of 7.2 figures must be wind corrected. That is, the looping segment must end exactly over the point that it was begun. Early or late completion of the looping segment earns a score downgrade. A looping segment must be a perfect half circle. Observe variations in the radius of the loop as they occur are score downgrades. When complementary rolls are added to these basic figures, the looping segment and the roll must flow from one to the other without the insertion of a visible line. A brief hesitation is permitted. A visible line earns a score downgrade. The longer the line, the higher the score downgrade. When a roll is added to a figure, the competitor must not begin that roll during the looping segment or a score downgrade is earned. The 2 diagrams shown here illustrate errors that competitors make when flying family 7.2 figures. When a judge sees the competitor begin this figure, the judge looks at the area shown by R1 to set the expectation for the radius of the looping segment that will be flown throughout the figure. Each diagram here illustrates in area R2 where a competitor might tighten the radius or open the radius, earning a score downgrade. In addition, the competitor might finish the looping segment before arriving at the spot that the looping segment was started, or the competitor might finish the looping segment beyond the spot that the looping segment was started. Both situations earn a score downgrade. Aresti's subfamily 7.3 figures are 3/4 looping figures. 2 of them are illustrated here. They all have an entry 45 line, a 3/4 loop, and an ending 45 line. We often call these goldfish. The first and second 45 lines may be different lengths, and each 45 line may have a complementary roll element added to it, which must be centered on that line. Judging criteria for 7.3 figures. The looping segments must be wind corrected. Look for the top of the looping segment to be vertically in line with the bottom of the looping segment. Observe tilt of the looping segment is a score downgrade. The looping segment must be flown as a perfect 3/4 circle. Variations of the radius of the loop are downgraded each time they are observed. The 45 lines must be flown with the aircraft's zero lift axis at 45 degrees. If a steep or shallow observation is made, that's a score downgrade. And when complementary rolls are added, the competitor must center those rolls on the line. The illustration here shows what a perfect 7.3 figure must look like. The entry point and the exit point of the looping segment must be vertically aligned. The top and the bottom of the loop must be vertically aligned. The 3/4 loop must have a constant wind corrected radius, and the 45-degree lines are flown with the zero lift axis of the aircraft at 45 degrees, not wind corrected. Aresti subfamily 7.4 is whole loops. We see examples of each type here. The family is divided into loops, square loops, diamond loops, octagon loops, and reversing whole loops. Each type of the whole loop has some of its own grading criteria. Here we have examples of 7.4.1 and 7.4.2 whole loops of the type most of us are most familiar with. The 7.4.1 loops begin and end in the same aircraft attitude. The 7.4.2 loops begin in one aircraft attitude and end in the opposite aircraft attitude. They are all drawn as constant radius vertical circles, and they may all begin with the aircraft upright or inverted and have a complementary roll or roll combination at the midpoint. Aresti 7.4.1 and 7.4.2 whole loops are to be flown so that the aircraft flight path follows a constant wind-corrected radius. Each observed change in the flight path radius earns a score downgrade. Whole loops are to be flown to exit at the same altitude as they are entered. Observed high or low exits are a score downgrade. These illustrations show common errors in competitor execution of whole loops. When a judge sees the beginning of a whole loop, the area marked R1 in these diagrams sets the judge's expectations for the entire execution of the remainder of the loop. These two illustrations show common errors made by a competitor: tightening the radius of the loop, opening the radius of the loop, exiting high, exiting low. A judge may see a loop flown to be tall and skinny, looking like a script L, or the entry and exit altitudes may be different, making the loop look like a script E. In this case, we apply Rulebook Section 8.4.1 as guidance. That rulebook section speaks to how rolls must be centered on lines, and if there is a visible difference in the line lengths, we downgrade the score 1 point. If there's a 2-to-1 difference, we downgrade the score 2 points. So if a loop is visibly taller than it is wide, we might apply a 1-point downgrade. If it is twice as tall as it is wide, we might apply a 2-point downgrade. The illustration here shows a loop that is taller than it is wide, where there are variations in radius at multiple points, and the exit altitude is lower than the entry altitude. So we might find 6 points of score downgrade watching a competitor fly what's shown here. Whole loops may have a complementary roll element at the center of the apex for up figures or nadir for down figures. The execution of the roll elements must follow the curve of the loop. The competitor must not insert a line with the roll and then resume the curve of the loop. In that case, a minimum 2-point score downgrade is earned. The start and end of the roll elements must be equal distance from the apex or nadir. If the roll element or roll combination is off-centered, the score downgrade is 1 point per 5 degrees off-center. And where the complementary roll element is a roll combination, the transition from one roll to the next need not be centered. The overall roll combination must be centered. Aresti 7.4.3 and 7.4.4 figures are square loops. As the 4 examples here show, square loops may begin with one aircraft orientation, upright or inverted, have a complementary roll combination on the middle horizontal line, and they may end in the same or opposite orientation as in which they were entered. Judging criteria. All 4 lines of a square loop must be flown to be the same length. A square loop's vertical lines are not wind corrected. Like all vertical lines, they are flown with the aircraft zero lift axis vertical. The wind may make the square loop into a trapezoid, as illustrated above. Horizontal lines are flown at a constant altitude. The second last horizontal line must be flown until it is as long as the previous 3 lines. And all 4 corners must be flown to be the same wind-corrected constant radius. The judge needs to look at the length of the lines and the radiuses of all the corners. This diagram illustrates that each of the lines of the square loop must be the same length, and each of the corners of the square loop must be flown to the same radius. If a competitor flies a vertical line with the aircraft zero lift axis not vertical, downgrade the score 1 point per 5 degrees off vertical. If the competitor flies the horizontal line, climbing or descending, downgrade 1 point per 5 degrees away from horizontal flight. The competitor must fly that last horizontal line, shown as D, until it is as long as the first vertical line. If it is not, there is a score downgrade. Once again, all 4 lines of a square loop must be flown to have the same length, and all 4 corners must be flown to have the same radius. A square loop is often composed with a roll on the second horizontal line, making the execution of that horizontal line longer. We always look at the first vertical line, here labeled A, and then we compare lines B, C, and D to that. If we see a visible difference, we apply a 1 point score downgrade to those lines. If we see that one of those lines is twice A, we apply a 2 point score downgrade. If it's more than twice A, we apply a 3 point score downgrade to that line segment. We apply the same logic to the corners. A judge looks at the first corner, here labeled little a, and when corners B, C, and D are executed, if those radii are visibly different, that's a 1 point score downgrade on each corner. If a corner is half the radius of A or twice the radius of A, that's a 2 point score downgrade for that corner. If the corner is tighter than half the radius or more open than twice the radius of A, we apply a 3-point score downgrade to that corner. Aresti family 7.4.5 figures are diamond loops. There are 4 examples shown here. Diamond loops are composed of 4 equal length 45 lines linked by 4 1/4 loops. All 4 loops must have the same wind-corrected radius. The first and third 45 lines may have complementary roll elements shown in the example in the bottom. We apply the same criteria to judging diamond loops as we have previously applied to square loops and other lines. The 45 lines are flown with the aircraft zero lift axis at 45 degrees and are not wind corrected. All 4 lines of a diamond loop must have the same length. If there is a complementary roll on the third line, that line still must be the same length as the first line. When line lengths are observed to be different lengths, we apply score downgrades. All 4 corners of the diamond loop must be flown with the same constant radius, which is wind corrected. The first corner sets the radius expected of the following 3 corners. Each of those 3 corners is compared to the first, and if there are visible differences, we have applied score downgrades.
6-5, figure 4 as an inverted diamond, pull to 45, negative snap, pull to the next 45, plain line. Line short after snap. Pull 45 up, half the distance, second 3 by 4, 3/4 roll back, pull to the next 45. Line short after roll. Plain roll. Final line is short, 4,0.
Aresti family 7.4.7 through 7.4.14 figures are reversing hole loops. These are composed of a 3/4 loop and a 1/4 looping segment that makes the figure exit direction opposite of the entry direction. As with other looping figures, each looping segment must be flown to a constant radius. And in these figures, a complementary roll element may be placed in 3 locations. This is shown in the figure illustrations at the bottom. The vertical center of the curve of a 3/4 loop segment may have a roll. The entry line may have a roll. The exit line may have a roll. Judging reversing hole loops, we use almost the same criteria as for regular hole loops. Each observed change in loop radius earns a score downgrade. Oval shape, high and low exits earn score downgrades. On the 3/4 loop segment, a complementary roll element that is not centered on the apex or nadir earns a score downgrade. And the transition from one looping segment to another must be smooth and without pause. An inserted line earns a score downgrade. On the entry and exit lines, roll elements must be executed with no more than a very brief perceptible pause when transitioning between the looping and rolling figure elements. Inserting a line earns a score downgrade. Aresti subfamily 7.5.1 through 7.5.8 figures are horizontal S's. There are 4 examples shown here. This subfamily of figures is composed of 5/8 looping segments connected by a 45 line. The 5/8 loops, as with all looping segments, must be flown as wind-corrected and constant radius. The top and bottom altitude of each looping segment must be the same as the nearest entry or exit line. The 45 line, as with all 45 lines, is flown with the aircraft zero lift axis at 45 degrees, not wind-corrected. Roll elements on the 45 line must be centered. Roll elements on the entry or exit lines must transition to or from the looping segments with no more than a very brief perceptible pause. The bottom 2 examples show rolls in all the allowed locations in a horizontal S.
Half roll, pull, 5/8 loop down to 45 up. Half roll to inverted. Pull, loop down. End loop level, upright.
When judging the competitor's execution of horizontal S's, we look for changes in loop radius and downgrade the competitor's score for each one, oval looping segment shape and high or low exits earn a score downgrade, complementary roll elements executed not centered on the 45 line earn a score downgrade, and the roll elements on the entry or exit lines when transitioning between the looping and rolling figure elements must have a, at most, brief perceptible pause. Inserting a line is a score downgrade. Aresti subfamily 7.5.9 through 7.5.10 figures are vertical S's. These figures are composed of two half looping segments. The half loops must each be flown as wind-corrected constant radius. A complementary roll element may be placed between the looping segments. The transition from looping segments to roll elements must have at most a brief perceptible pause. The complementary roll elements are executed on a horizontal line. If there are no complementary roll elements between the looping elements, those looping elements are to be flown and wind corrected so they appear directly on top of each other. Aresti subfamily 7.8.1 through 7.8.8 figures are horizontal eights. We often call them Cuban eights. They are composed of 1 3/4 loop, 1 5/8 loop, and 2 45 lines. These figures are to be flown to enter and exit at the same altitude. Both looping elements must be flown to have the same size. The tops of both looping elements must be at the same altitude, and the bottoms of both looping elements must be at the same altitude. Horizontal eights may have complementary roll elements placed on the 45 lines of the figures. When a roll element is flown on a 45 line, the roll element must be centered on that line. When different sized looping segments are flown, we downgrade the score, 1 point for visible difference, 2 points for a 2-to-1 difference, 3 points for greater than 2-to-1 difference. When the loops are flown to have different top and bottom altitudes, a score downgrade is also applied. Aresti 7.8.9 through 7.8.16 figures are horizontal super eights. These figures are composed of 2 3/4 loops and 3 45 lines. They are flown to enter and exit at different altitudes. But like Cuban eights, these figures must have looping elements flown to be the same size. These figures must be flown to have the tops of the looping elements at the same altitude, and they must be flown to have the bottom of the looping elements at the same altitude. Horizontal super eights may have complementary roll elements on the 3 45 lines, illustrated here. The complementary roll elements must be flown to be centered on their line. The entry and exit altitudes of these figures must be the same as the altitudes of the nearest looping elements, apex or nadir, whichever is closest. If the entry or exit line is flown within the range of altitudes covered by the looping segments, a score downgrade is applied. The exception is when an entry or exit 45 line is extended by multiple linked, unlinked, or opposing roll elements. In this case, the entry or exit altitude does not need to be aligned with the looping segments. Aresti family 7.8.17 through 7.8.22 figures are vertical eights. These figures are composed of 2 looping segments, the second one above or below the other. Looping segments must be flown as wind-corrected constant radius. The complementary roll elements may be placed in between the whole looping segments. The transition from whole looping segments two from roll elements must be at most a brief perceptible pause. Complementary roll elements added between the two loops are executed on a horizontal line. Where there are no complementary roll elements between the loops should be flown to be wind corrected and placed directly on top of each other.